for inviting me.
Our attention to Tamir Rice, you know, the 12-year-old who was shot by a police officer in Cleveland. A family attorney is joining us, Attorney Chandra. Attorney Chandra, welcome to WOL Radio.
Thank you so much thank you for having me on.
Most people know what happened with Tamir, but tell us. I want you to tell the story, because maybe we missed out a couple of facts or whatever but the story that you know and what the family told you.
Well, the story is captured on video, so fortunately the world can simply see this tragedy unfold before their eyes. And if you look at it from Tamir Rice's perspective, a 12-year-old boy was playing in the park when two police officers drove up really fast, and as soon as they stopped, in 1.7 seconds, one of those officers gunned Tamir down. Now, there are reports, and certainly the video also depicts that he was playing with a toy gun at the park, which was very close to his house. His sister came running upon the scene. They arrested his sister and detained her for some period of time while Tamir lay bleeding on the ground for 4 minutes, and those officers did not even bother to administer medical care as he lay dying. Eventually, someone came and administered first aid. He was taken to the hospital and was pronounced dead by the following day. It's a tragic situation, and what's happening now is what ought to be happening under the circumstances, which is a murder investigation. The problem that the family has is that these particular murder suspects are being treated differently and being given special treatment that no other citizen would ever be afforded under the circumstances.
And I got to ask you this: Tamir, was he a large fellow? I know he's 12 years old, but in the case of Michael Brown, they said he was built like a football player, and the police officer says he was afraid of his life. And we hear that all the time with a lot of these controversial shootings. These police officers say they're afraid for their lives. So was Tamir? I know he's 12 years old, but was he a strapping, hulking type of football player?
There are reports that he was a little large for his age, but at the end of the day, 1.7 seconds, drive right up immediately and shoot, don't assess the situation. There were reports in the immediate aftermath of the shooting by the Division of Police brass that 3 warnings were called out. Well, that's belied by anybody who watches the video. That couldn't possibly be the case. So we have a situation here in which a 12-year-old boy is dead.
Right. Hold that thought right there. I guess he's an attorney.
My phone number is
Chandra,
301.
He's the attorney for the Tamir Rice family. That shooting shocked the nation, at least some parts of the nation. The 12-year-old was there with the toy gun. They say has that been confirmed though that he did have a toy gun, Counselor?
Yes.
He did have a toy gun. But I understand that when the 911 call was made, that the person who made the call said it looks like a toy gun. Am I correct in saying that?
Correct. Words to that effect.
And this police officer drives up within, less than a couple of minutes? He makes a decision that it's a real gun and shoots this kid?
Well, it appears that decision is simply made in advance. But the gun was not in the toy gun was not in the boy's hand. It may have been in his waistband. But the boy got up from the bench. He was just sitting on a park bench. Police car drove up at rapid speed, and you can see that in the video. You don't have to rely on my account for it. And pretty much immediately, the officer gets out of the car and fires. So there's no assessment of the situation. There's no effort to really try to de-escalate the situation. Not that there was a situation to de-escalate. It's an immediate shot. And so, one of the issues that we have with the prosecutor's approach to this case is that there are assumptions being made in the absence of testimony by the officers who've not given statements, who haven't testified. But there is an assumption being made that the officers were making a split-second decision in reaction to something, as opposed to maybe even having decided before they're driving up, or deciding as they're driving up, or deciding immediately upon getting out of the car to fire, not deciding at all, just firing. So there's a lot of questions and no answers for the Rice family, and it's really been devastating for them to see the criminal justice process completely off track.
Well, I got to ask you, because you mentioned the officers, but did both officers fire at him? Was it one officer? And two,
No.
what happened to the one who fired the shot? Are they still on the force?
It was Officer Lohman who fired the shot. He was in the passenger seat. Officer Garnback is the one who drove up. It is my understanding that they are not on duty now pending the investigation, but I'm uncertain about that.
There have been reports that that officer who fired the shot has been exonerated. Any truth to that?
No, I don't think that that's a correct interpretation. Here's what is happening right now, is that the prosecutor, Tim McGinty, our county prosecutor, is engaged in what he claims is an investigation of the circumstances with a plan to present the matter to a grand jury and let the grand jury decide. The problem is that his approach has been so irregular and so strange that the Rice family has lost confidence that justice for Tamir Rice will be achieved through these proceedings. The prosecutor did release last Saturday night, a week ago Saturday night, at 8 p.m., he put on his website 2 pro-defense, pro-police, so-called expert reports that he had solicited and obtained. And that's a highly unusual move for any prosecutor to do the defense's work for them, much less to put it out in public, tainting the grand jury proceedings, which is what the prosecutor did. I would suggest to you, sir, that those reports do not exonerate the officers, even though they purport to, because they're so fatally flawed. They fail to cover critical facts, including some of the ones I gave you, that they let the boy bleed to death, that they rushed up and fired immediately. They are written by pro-police experts who've been discredited by subsequent media reports as being biased, and at least one of them had already formulated a position on the case before being engaged. The other had had her views rejected by the U.S. Department of Justice as too extreme, as fatally flawed in the past. So, you know, there are a lot of very troubling things about the way the grand jury process is unfolding, the pre-grand jury process is unfolding as orchestrated by this prosecutor. That's the concern of the Rice family.
Well, I got to ask you this. Walter Scott and I think Eric Garner, I think they settled with their respective cities over the shootings, the death. Have they talked settlement with you? Is that something you can talk about? If you can't, we understand.
Yeah, I prefer not to discuss the civil proceeding. There's a pending federal civil rights lawsuit in federal court, and out of respect to the judge and the process there, that's not what I'd like to discuss today. I think it's fair to say there's been no overture or discussion by the city or its officials. But for purposes of today, I'm prepared to discuss with you the Rice family's concerns about justice for Tamir through the criminal justice process, which is incredibly important to them. I mean, it is the most important thing to them. And unfortunately, they're seeing a process that is completely off track.
Well, can a special prosecutor be called in? If so, how does that process work?
Well, Samaria Rice, the mother, the grieving mother of Tamir Rice, has called for a special prosecutor. She's asked for a special prosecutor because, in her view, the grand jury process has been so thoroughly tainted by this prosecutor who seems to be going out of his way to try to figure out a way to clear the officers from her perspective. So she has called for a special prosecutor. We are calling for a special prosecutor on her behalf. That would require this prosecutor to step aside and recognize that he has lost the confidence of the crime victim's family. Unfortunately, he has refused to do so. And, he's the guy in charge of the process who gets to make a one-sided presentation to the grand jury behind closed doors, all the while claiming transparency.
Yeah, but he's got to report to somebody. Who's his boss?
He's an independently elected official. His boss is the voters, but he doesn't face the voters for a couple more years at least.
Wow. So not even the governor can get involved in this?
No. The Ohio Attorney General could appoint a special prosecutor if the county prosecutor requested it and stepped aside. And we're looking at whether there are other options, such as potentially asking the court to remove the prosecutor. But it's an unlikely scenario. I think that the system is set up to give this prosecutor vast discretion And that's why when we have the opportunity to select our prosecutors, who they are is incredibly important.
So what are their options then? Because it seems like the options are pretty limited right now.
Do you mean the family's options?
Yeah.
They are very limited. And that's why, sadly, they have all but written off the criminal justice process as being an avenue for justice for Tamir. And you can only imagine how painful that is for a grieving mother and the rest of her family. It is so painful to think that, and from their perspective, they don't think a fair-minded presentation of the evidence, as a prosecutor would normally do. A prosecutor doesn't bend over backwards going out soliciting defense-oriented so-called expert reports. A prosecutor's job is to determine for him or herself, do I think there's probable cause to pursue this offense, and then present that case to the grand jury and seek to secure an indictment? Or tell the grand jury, I don't think there's probable cause here, you shouldn't do anything. The problem is that this prosecutor is claiming transparency, leaking these defense-oriented reports at 8 p.m. to the media, which, by the way, they weren't provided to the family in advance, despite our request. They were given to the media hours in advance of the 8 p.m. website release so that their articles were already written by 8:04 p.m. The first article by the AP was sent to us at 8:04, and they said, do you have a comment now? So they'd clearly gotten the stuff hours in advance. It's an unfortunate attempt to sabotage the family's chance at justice.
And I really... Hold on a second, Counselor, because we're going to step aside for...
On the show. Number one on everybody list. Carl Nelson on 1450 WOL.
Thank you for rolling with us at 26 minutes after the hour. On with Attorney Chandra. He's the family attorney for the Rice family. Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was shot in a park in Cleveland. You know the story. He was there with a toy gun, and according to the attorney, the gun wasn't even in his hand. It was in his waist. And you said he was sitting down on a park bench, Counselor?
Yes, he was just sitting on a park bench as the police car drove up rapidly. He gets up off the bench and walks toward them, and then he's shot. There's some claims that he was reaching for the waistband, but if he was actually trying to comply with the alleged, shout-out by the officers who dropped the weapon, then, wouldn't you expect him to be, grabbing it, throw it down? So it's very unclear what was going on in the officer's mind, but what is clear is that within 1.7 seconds, certainly no time for any officer to assess the situation and ensure public safety, that this boy was just shot dead on the spot.
Do we have any eyewitnesses, or is just the camera? Other than the cops?
There's the camera. I don't know, other than the police, that there are eyewitnesses. There's certainly eyewitnesses to immediately what happens after the scene, but the sheriff's report treats those issues.
And this was a Cleveland Police Department or a sheriff?
There's two Cleveland police officers.
How's the mother keeping up on this? Because the 12-year-old child is still her baby. And to go through all of this, having it being killed, and then trying to fight justice, and the people who did it trying to find some technicality to get off. So how's she holding up?
Well, for anyone who's a parent, they can certainly empathize and put themselves in her shoes and what it must feel like. And I would commend to all of your listeners Connie Schultz's interview with Samaria Rice on Politico.com. It is really a remarkable expression of how Samaria Rice is feeling right now. Every day is difficult. Every day she rewatches the video over and over again. And I, as a parent, could imagine myself doing that, asking herself the question, what were you thinking, Tamir, at that moment? Did you know what was about to happen to you? It's devastating. It hurts. But she's also a strong woman, and she's determined to get justice for Tamir. And it's been devastating to see the prosecutor behaving this way. It's really hurt her, but she is determined to try to move forward and push toward justice for Tamir. And that's why so many people in the community, like your listeners, need to be a part of that and ensuring that our government is accountable.
I got to ask you this other question, too. In Charleston, after the shooting in Charleston, the people in Charleston says, well, we forgive Dylan, whatever his last name is. We forgive him. Has she reached that point yet where she says she forgives the police officer who killed her child?
We're not there yet because justice hasn't been served.
And that's understandable. 30 minutes after the hour, 800-450-7876. Attorney Chandra is the family attorney for Tamir Rice, who represents his mother. They're in a legal battle here since his shooting. He's 12 years old. You know the story. He was in a park, had a toy gun, and he was in his waist. Somebody called the police. The cops rolled up within a matter of, what, you say seconds, Attorney?
1.7 seconds. As soon as the car pulls up, within 1.7 seconds, they shot that boy dead.
So that was, if you were trying the case, if this was not a police officer, that would be what, premeditated murder?
Well, I don't know about premeditated or not, but I think something important for your listeners to understand is that Ohio has, as every other state does, an aggravated murder statute, right? The worst kind of murder at the top of the scale. And we typically think of it for assassinations or for somebody who's plotting revenge against an enemy and they plan it and then they kill that person. That's what we usually think of as aggravated murder. The aggravation is the pre-calculation and design. Those are the words of the statute. But in Ohio, there's a prong of the statute that provides that if the person who you've killed is under the age of 13, the elements of pre-calculation and design are out. All you have to do is have a purpose to kill. And for that reason, Tamir Rice has asked the prosecutor to seek an aggravated murder charge from the grand jury and to properly instruct them that the age of the victim, Tamir Rice, is sufficient aggravation to constitute aggravated murder.
Now you mentioned that the prosecution, they dropped some information over the weekend. Do you see that as a way of trying to taint the possible jury pool?
Well, yes, number one, but also what we really believe it is an effort to avoid accountability. You know, this prosecutor, if he's not going to step aside, which he should, because he's tainted the process, he really needs to stand up publicly and state what his view is instead of sort of projecting this faux equanimity that, you know, and agnosticism that, gee, I have no idea, I'm going to let the grand jury decide. That's not what prosecutors do. They wear the jacket. They have to be accountable. So we need him to stand up and take a position. Do you believe there's probable cause or not? If yes, then ask for it from the grand jury. Advocate as you would for an ordinary crime victim. If no, explain yourself. But at the end of the day, this prosecutor right now isn't doing that. He hasn't committed firmly to doing that. And so as a result, he can go behind the secrecy of the grand jury and essentially make a presentation that results in no indictment. And that's what we think is going on here, is that this is a way to try to lay the groundwork and convince the public, look, there's nothing to see here, folks, move along. So when there's a no bill of indictment, he isn't held accountable. That's what the Rice family suspects is going on. And quite frankly, her counsel share that view. I myself, as a former federal prosecutor, can promise you, and there was never once agnostic before a grand jury. It's a one-sided presentation. You either tell them, we think there's probable cause here, here's the law, here are the facts, please indict, or you say, look, after the investigation, we now think there's nothing to see here, folks, we're not asking you to indict.
How far along are we? What's the timetable look like?
Well, that's the other horrifying thing about this case. As you saw by contrast in Baltimore and South Carolina, charges were swift and the accountability process started swiftly. Here we are now over 11 months after the shooting, and we still don't even have the beginning of a presentation to a grand jury. What we have been told is that the prosecutor, by late this month, will begin presenting this case to the grand jury, that it will take weeks and weeks and maybe months and months. We've been told, the last thing we were told was late December, early January. We're now hearing from people talking to the prosecutor that it might be the beginning of January. You don't want the public to know. Cleveland, in the middle of winter, in the middle of a blizzard, they're going to release a no bill of indictment news to the public. I mean, it's just an effort to try to hope, at least this is what the Rice family feels, it's an effort to try to help the public forget about Tamir Rice and not be as concerned about justice for Tamir.
Right. I think that's what they're hoping for. That with a delay, they'll just keep dragging it out. You're right, and make an announcement in the dead of winter when folks are, inclined to try to stay warm instead of getting out in the streets. But I got to ask you this, because we saw on television the police chief almost in tears at a recent drive-by shooting. But I think it was a 3-year-old infant got shot in Cleveland. And so,
Yes.
Has he or any of the police officers, contacted the Rice family and says, "Hey, I'm sorry for what happened to your child"? Even if they don't have to say anything, the officer was wrong, but they contacted the family on the side, not officially. But I want you to respond to that on the other side, because we have to take a news update.
Carl Nelson weekdays from 6 to 10 a.m. on 1450 WOL.
And thank you for staying with us, folks. Our guest is Attorney Chandra. He's the family attorney for Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was shot to death in Cleveland by a police officer. And before we left for the news, I was asking the attorney if there's been any remorse from the police force, because we saw on national TV the chief of police in Cleveland. He was crying on national TV, an infant being shot to death in a drive-by shooting, and he was moved. And we saw that. But and the question I asked before the news was, did they show any sort of remorse? Not necessarily, if not the chief or any of the people on the police force, say, "Hey, call the family and say that was wrong," or "I feel your pain." Has the mother heard any of those kind of statements from any of the officers on the Cleveland police force?
I do not believe so, but please keep in mind that I came in as new counsel over the summer, and there had been previous counsel representing the Rice family back to the date of the incident. So if that occurred, I'm not aware of it. There's certainly been no discussion of it. I'm certainly not aware of any direct personal outreach as opposed to some sort of a public statement. Look, we're not suggesting in any way that the senior police brass or the mayor or the city of Cleveland or the safety director are happy that this occurred. I'm sure they must feel quite saddened that a 12-year-old boy lost his life. But ultimately, it comes down to whether or not these officers will be held accountable. Ultimately, it comes down to, words don't matter as much as real action in holding people accountable and making an effort to give Samaria Rice and her family justice. And instead, what we're facing right now is a resistance to that, a resistance, it seems, generally in the police culture with the police union and their constant denial that any officer could ever do anything wrong, ever, and similarly a kind of effort to bend over backwards for these officers on the part of the county prosecutor. Those trends are disturbing, and they ought to disturb the general population and not just the African-American community.
So what is the feeling? I know this is a kind of weird question to ask, because you got to be precise when you speak to lawyers, but what can you gauge the feeling, the sentiment in Cleveland about this shooting? Is there outrage? Are people still talking about it? Have they forgotten about Tamir?
I think that there is a very strong sentiment in our community that this was wrong, that this shooting was wrong, and that there ought to be justice and accountability, both through the criminal justice process and then also certainly administratively involving the police. And an effort to create a culture of prevention, to create a proper set of procedures and policies and training that will prevent this kind of tragedy from ever occurring to another Cleveland family. Now, is there an extremist, racist element, just as there is, it seems, in every community across this country, that thinks the police can do no wrong, and they'll blame the victim, and they'll blame the victim's family, and she must be a horrible mother, and that kind of hatred and vitriol that you see on the Cleveland.com comments and in other social media? Yes, that is occurring, and it's horrible when you see that. But I do not believe that that reflects the broader community sentiment, which is very concerned about this incident, because everybody understands that this was just a boy. This was just an innocent boy. This wasn't somebody engaged in criminal activity who then winds up getting shot, as in some other incidents that we've had. This was an innocent little boy.
You mentioned, there's been incidents on I guess on the internet talking about Tamir, but We saw that what happened to Trayvon Martin, and they tried to say that he was a gangbanger, he smoked weed, and he had stuff in his bag when he got suspended from school and all that. Have we had any of that kind of stuff come out on Tamir?
Well, certainly there's no such information about Tamir, right? That would just be nonsense. But we do see a lot of stupid, racist people making those kinds of comments in social media. They have no idea what the heck they're talking about, but they're spreading this kind of nonsense, this kind of cancerous nonsense. And, you know, what we have to do is just turn our eyes away from that and hope and pray that they don't reflect a broader community sentiment or broader community racism or hatred. As a trial lawyer, as somebody who earns his living and practices his craft and profession based on the assumption that we will be able to find an ordinary group of citizens of goodwill who will do the right thing, you know, I simply can't believe that those folks reflect broader community sentiment, that in fact the majority of people are people who want to see justice done.
17 minutes away from the top of the hour. Our guest is Attorney Chandra. He's the attorney for the Rice family, 12-year-old Tamir Rice. I'm sure you heard the story. He was shot to death by Cleveland police. He had a toy gun, and he was sitting in the park, and the cops came up within a couple of seconds. They made the decision. And that's why I was asking you, Counselor, because they made the decision so quickly, could if it was a drive-by, wouldn't that be premeditated? Because they had to come in thinking they're going to shoot. Well, there's a person with a gun, so I'm going to shoot him. Because wasn't that decision already made?
Well, certainly that is an open question, and I think that's why these efforts by the prosecutor to go get pro-defense-oriented so-called experts who have these flawed backgrounds to just decide that question when the officers haven't even been interviewed. They haven't been cross-examined. They haven't had their testimony tested. So we shouldn't just make assumptions about what was in their mind one way or the other. You know, it's certainly an open question what you're saying. And so remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the grand jury phase in which a grand jury simply decides whether there's probable cause that a crime was committed. We have the video. We have probable cause that a crime was committed. Let a jury ultimately decide whether or not these folks are guilty of crimes.
Yeah, but you're talking about a grand jury. We saw what happened in Ferguson as well. You know, so should we put our faith in the grand jury?
Well, here's the thing. That's why the identity of the prosecutor and the behavior of the prosecutor matters, because grand juries are a very useful tool for performing investigations and for being a check on prosecutors, ordinarily in the other direction. That if you have an overzealous prosecutor, at least in theory, a grand jury ought to be able to sort things out and decide whether or not they're going to let a prosecutor get a charge. But because it's a one-sided presentation, the prosecutor can really color the direction of the presentation behind the secrecy of the grand jury, behind that veil. And so this is the problem, is that we have a prosecutor now who is making it apparent that he apparently has no interest in pursuing charges to get justice for Tamir, but is putting the information out in public, either one, to taint potential grand jurors, or two, or both, to try to ease the public reaction to there being a no bill of indictment.
Right, and like I mentioned, we saw that play out in Ferguson with Mike Brown. 800-450-7876. Attorney, do we know anything about the police officer who pulled the trigger? Do we know anything about his background? Have you had a chance to look at his records?
Yes, the published reports that occurred in the media almost immediately after the shooting are quite shocking. He had been hired by the Cleveland Division of Police without a thorough and proper background check. He had had significant problems at his prior employer, the City of Independence, which is a suburb of the city of Cleveland, where his own chief and supervisor had said that he was unfit for duty. He had apparently had some sort of a mental breakdown on the firing range where he was, weeping uncontrollably. I mean, this is the kind of information that's coming out from public records and from public media reports, and yet this individual was hired by the Cleveland Division of Police. which makes the notion of a prosecutor or the prosecutor's so-called expert suggesting that somehow he was, quote-unquote, objectively reasonable in what he did.
Right, hold that thought right there, Counselor, because we've got to step aside for a couple of announcements. Again, we're 8 minutes away from the top of the hour. The top of the hour, psychiatrist Dr. Frances Kerswelson is going to join us. She's going to talk about gentrification, how to survive gentrification, and she's going to discuss a recent Washington Post article. But right now, we're with Attorney Chandra. He represents the family of Tamir Rice. He's the 12-year-old Cleveland boy who was shot to death by a Cleveland police officer. And the police officer, I guess, will claim that he feared for his life because he said that Tamir had a toy gun. Before we left for the break, you were saying that he had all these issues. How is it possible for someone all those issues that you just mentioned to get a job on the police force, any police force?
Well, clearly people weren't doing their jobs, and it was clearly some sort of a culture in which it was okay to not do your job to properly vet police officer candidates. And this is really why there's so much public concern in Cleveland and beyond, that while we respect police officers and the jobs they do and the risks that they put themselves through every single day, we, the public, need to have confidence in who our police officers are, because when we entrust someone with a badge and a gun, we are entrusting them with our lives. And so it's just horrifying to learn after the fact that this fellow had this kind of problematic background that made him unfit for duty, according to even his own prior employer. But now the Rice family has to live with those consequences, which is the death of a 12-year-old child.
Now, has he explained why he fired without, just came guns blazing when he drove up onto the kid? What did he say? What's he saying? What was the reason?
He's given no testimony, as is his right, because he is, at least technically for now, a criminal suspect until this prosecutor has, essentially tossed the case. But for now, he's a criminal suspect, so he's invoking his Fifth Amendment rights, as is his right. But
doesn't he have to file a police report?
He's given no testimony. I think there may have been some we've read media reports that there were some initial statements made to some investigators, but I don't think they provide a strong window one way or the other into what his thinking was. And so the bottom line is that we don't have clear answers. What we have is a video that depicts a police car driving up to the scene at rapid speed and the officer getting out immediately and firing.
And the other officer in the car, any word from him? Is he still on the force? Is he quiet? Is he saying anything? What's his position?
He too is not making public statements or offering testimony. And apparently, according to the prosecutor's office's public statements, those officers are refusing to testify before the grand jury. And they have the right not to testify before the grand jury. But by the same token, then at that point, there should be no reason that the prosecutor should be declaring that there's no probable cause, or that he should pretend to be agnostic and then have the grand jury throw up its hands because he's throwing up his hands and saying, we don't know. I want to point something out. Imagine, for example, that you sat on a grand jury, case after case, murder cases, rape cases, burglary cases, crack pipe cases. And every single time, at the end of the presentation of evidence, the prosecutor turns to the grand jury and says, and so, based on the law we've instructed you and the facts you've heard, we request that you return an indictment against this individual. And all of a sudden one day, when there's two police officers involved, the prosecutor's wringing his hand saying, gee, I don't know what to think. You figure it out. Aren't you going to get the message that the prosecutor doesn't think there's anything there?
Yeah, again, we saw that out in Ferguson with the Mike Brown case, and the prosecutor there, how he tilted the evidence or the case towards the police officer and the whole way. So I'm just wondering, are you concerned that may happen to him if he does decide to convene a grand jury?
Well, it's clear it's going to happen, and here's how we know that, right? Not only does he leak these so-called expert reports from biased experts that don't even cover critical facts, like the rapid fire driving up and shooting immediately, letting the boy bleed to death on the ground, and so on. But in addition, he's been publicly vouched for these experts when we've criticized him and said, no, they're so smart, they're so experienced, they have so... Well, wait a minute. That means you are not going to cross-examine those so-called experts before the grand jury about the very points that we're criticizing that they failed to cover in their report and about their biases. So we do believe, the Rice family certainly believes at this point he has signaled to the world that he really has no interest in pursuing this, and they are expecting that there will be no indictment because of the prosecutor's behavior unless he steps aside and lets a truly independent prosecutor who doesn't have these pro-police biases to take the case forward.
And then we had a few years prior to this where police officers fired into 20, 30 shots into
yes, it was 137 shots.
137 shots. And nothing came of that either. How much more the citizens in Cleveland are going to accept this? Well,
Carl, at least in that case, I'm not excusing anything, but at least in that case, these were two individuals involved in a high-speed chase, right, that were the decedents. And there was at least a suspicion of criminal activity. Here, there was no. Remember, Ohio is an open carry state, and so you can carry a weapon, right? I mean, but listen, it's very hard for me to look at this case and not say, look, if this had been a white person in a suburb, would they have been shot immediately? I mean, you don't want to bring race into this, but bringing race into this is inescapable. Because I don't think there's a person with common sense that would think that the same thing would happen had the circumstances been demographically different.
All right. Hang on a second, Counselor. We've got to step aside for a traffic update. We'll come back. We'll finish up with you, and then we'll also speak with Dr. Francis Cresswell-Sing. 800-450-7876. You too can get in on the discussion. Your calls after the traffic report on 1450 WOL. The information is power.
North, WKYS HD2 Washington, WMMJ HD2 Bethesda, celebrating 35 years of
opinions of the following show do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of News Talk 1450 WOL, Radio 1 Incorporated, or their management.
Welcome to the Carl Nelson Show
on Washington, D.C.'s 1450 WOL Radio and live around the world on WOLDCnews.com.
Staying with us, folks. Momentarily, we'll be speaking with a psychiatrist, Dr. Francis Cresswell-Sing. But right now, we're with Attorney Chandra. Attorney Chandra represents the Tamir Rice family. You know, it's the 12-year-old kid that got shot in Cleveland by a police officer because he had a toy gun. Line 2, Philip has joined us from Chicago, has a question for you, Counselor. Philip?
Good morning. Good morning. Is it true that 90+% of the prosecutors nationwide, or state prosecutors nationwide, are white male?
I don't have access to that statistic. It wouldn't surprise me if that were true.
And if it is true, I mean, most prosecutors are voted in and out. Is that correct?
Yes. Most are elected officials.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. So in that vein, when is this prosecutor up for re-election again? I think you mentioned it earlier.
I believe it would be in the 2017 cycle, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I think it would be the 2017 cycle.
All right. Before we let you go, what's the timetable? What are we looking at now? How much is there a deadline where the prosecutor has to decide whether to impanel a grand jury, or can he just drag it out as long as possible?
Well, he controls the process. He can take as long as he wants, and he is.
And when you say as long as he wants, because this has gone on for about almost a year now, right, or more? Can is it 2 or 3 years? Is there a cap? Does he have to?
No, there's no cap. He controls the process. He can take as long as he wants. I mean, theoretically, as a matter of law, he could even take beyond the statute of limitations for aggravated murder, which is years and years. I mean, he controls the process before the grand jury. And that's why it's so important that the public not be fooled by claims of transparency when all the signals suggest that there's a real effort to try to reach a negative result in terms of an indictment. And, I hasten to add that Samaria Rice and her family actually were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt until he started pulling these latest shenanigans with going out and soliciting defense-oriented reports and releasing them to the media and not giving them to her despite her request. Just the sandbagging and sabotage that's going on has made her lose confidence in the process. She was really hopeful that despite the crazy amount of time being taken, that there was a real effort to get to the bottom of this, but she no longer has that confidence.
She believed in the system.
She did, because she had to. She had to cling to that hope that she could secure justice for Tamir through this criminal justice process. And unfortunately, that any such hope is now dangling only by a strand at this point.
All right, Attorney, we're going to let you go, and we'll keep an eye on this. And if something changes, we'll definitely give you another call.